So it's an honor to introduce tonight's plenary speaker. And now I know what you're thinking when I say that. Well, of course, he has to say that. It's his boss. But trust me, I mean it when I say it's an honor to introduce the president of this great organization that I have had the blessing to work at for the past 5 years. In addition to his responsibilities as president of Acton Institute, which, as you know, sends him around the globe frequently, he is also pastor of a thriving parish and school just west of here. In fact, his school, Sacred Heart Academy, just graduated its very first high school class. And tonight's speaker has been published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and appeared on CNN, ABC, BBC, NPR, and many others. His list of accomplishments goes on and on and on. But you already knew all of this. So I want to tell a quick personal story. That's the story of my first introduction to tonight's speaker. It was spring break of my sophomore year at Bethel College in Indiana. I found myself at a Barnes & Noble prior to having knee surgery at the end of a depressing basketball season. So of course, I needed a really good book to get me through it. Meandering through the shelves, I stumbled upon a fascinating book, Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy, written by this priest, Reverend Robert Sirico. As I poured through the book over the next week, Reverend Sirico's vision for the free and virtuous society animated me in such a way intellectually that I had not experienced before. And as a good Lutheran, I'm sure my parents were concerned. So at the end of that week, my sophomore year, I knew I needed to find a way to work at the Acton Institute and for Father Sirico. 2 years later, I found myself packing my then beat-up Oldsmobile Intrigue with everything I owned, which wasn't much, and moving to Grand Rapids to work at this wonderful institution. So I want to thank Father Sirico, one, for numbing my knee pain that week, and second, for keeping me around this long. It's been an immense pleasure and joy working for you and the Acton Institute team for the past 5 years. You have had a profound impact on my life, and I know you've had a profound impact on the lives of many people here. So join me in welcoming Father Sirico. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. You may know, I don't know if you know, but Patrick's going to be getting married to another member of our staff in about 2 weeks. And I think you're all invited to the wedding, right, on the Leelanau Peninsula. Now, I know that Patrick meant very well by that introduction, but when he says, you know, introducing me and talking about, and it goes on and on and on, and I'm thinking, do they think the speech is going to go on and on and on? But then when he says, he thanks me for writing a book that acted as, in effect, an anesthetic. Amanda, you've got to work on this man. No, thank you. Thank you for being with us. This is always a great and joyful and exhausting week for us. And I know that you, so many of you have personally expressed your gratitude for the work of the Institute, but our staff is an incredible group of dedicated people who believe in what we're doing. And they have made this happen by attending to numerous details. Some of them will not be taking off the next few days. They will be cleaning up and assessing and things like that. So the staff, but also our incredible group of benefactors. I've said this before, but it's worth noting again. Just think of people making donations to provide your scholarships. They are detaching themselves from their money and giving it to people they don't know. Why are they doing this? They're doing it because they believe in ideas. And what I hope has happened this week is that you come to value these ideas and show your appreciation by giving it forward, by sharing those ideas with your networks, with the people with whom you have influence, the people who read what you write, who hear what you preach, under whose ministry, who are under your ministry, please, the best thank you can give to us is to share these ideas that you've experienced. Now, how is this for a great motto for a business? Respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. Now, that very same business put forth its vision like this: we treat others as we would like to be treated ourselves. We do not tolerate abusive or disrespectful treatment. Ruthlessness, callousness, and arrogance don't belong here. That sentence, those sentences, these words are taken from the motto and the vision statement of the Enron Corporation. Now, for those of you too young to recall, Enron was an energy, commodities, and services company based in Houston, Texas, and it underwent a spectacular collapse and scandal about the year 2000. At its height, it employed some 29,000 people. Think of that. With revenues of about $100 billion. Fortune magazine, for 6 consecutive years, listed Enron as America's most ethical company, one of the most ethical companies and innovative companies in the United States. And you would think that was true because as all of the reports came out on Enron, you found that there were Christians, believers, right at the top of the company. You can hear it echoed in their motto, can't you? That we're going to treat everybody as we want to be treated ourselves. 20 or 25 years ago, those business executives might have been sitting in this audience. Those business executives might have even been donors to the Acton Institute. In point of fact, they were not. Oh, you laugh, but they might have been donors to your ministries. They might have been donors to, and I'm not going to ask anybody if they were, but there's a good chance, to your religious communities, your schools. The collapse of Enron brought to light a wide series of scandalous, unethical practices that constituted the interior culture of Enron, and that resulted, for example, in 14,000 of their employees who had 60% of their retirement savings wrapped up in Enron stock, losing their retirement savings overnight. Now, at the time, some progressive religious writers were quick to dissect the whole situation, and what did they do? They indicted capitalism. They said that this was representative of a free market. This was representative of the moral and ethical tragedy that Enron represented, precisely all of that. To their minds, this was intrinsic to capitalism. And we need to ask ourselves if they were right. Now, if we're going to believe the recent polling data, particularly Gallup poll, we will believe that 51% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 feel positively about socialism. I think there's something worth pondering right there. What I see is confusion. I see a confusion of definitions, a confusion of intentions, and especially a confusion as to the practical way that we can go about attaining our intentions. And if we learn anything from the experience of Enron and the whole fiasco that represents, it is that good intentions are not enough. Admittedly, an overused phrase, but nonetheless true. The most frequent of the great debates among people have to do with our obligations within society, and they are not so much about what we want to achieve, not about the goals. Most of those debates are on how we're going to go about achieving them. We all want to put an end to misery, to hunger, to poverty. Who doesn't want to do that? Across the board. Maybe a few maniacs, but they're not part of the debate. The question isn't what we want to achieve. The question is how we're going to go about achieving it. Now, the Acton Institute has a motto of its own. It says, we believe in connecting good intentions with sound economics. Isn't that a good part of the reason that you're here? You came to learn how to do that. As some of you pastors and preachers know now, some of the most difficult biblical texts to preach from are those having to do with the parables. And the parables seem very familiar to us. We've heard them over and over again. We get confused because we don't know what gospel they came from. We know that they're misunderstood. People get very particular about it, about what they hear. And they present to us a challenge to interpret properly and apply responsibly. Because not all of the parables contain obvious meanings. Now, you all probably know the parable found in the Gospel of St. Matthew, which begins, a man had 2 sons, and he asked his sons to go out into the vineyard to work. The first son replied with an outright refusal. It strikes me as I read that text that his words are very direct. They almost sound like an act of rebellion. I will not go, he says. But then later, it says he repents. He thought better of it. He had a change of mind. Some kind of remorse, whatever it was. Nothing said about the second son's rebellion or change of mind, because the second son is sent out. And this is left ambiguous. The bottom line is that the second son who is sent out says he'll go, but he never does it. He takes no action. Now, here's the thing about these 2 sons. Both of them are essentially disobedient. My overall point, however, is that there is an insufficiency in each of these sons as to how they relate to the father. Now, I want to make an analogy to economic systems, but I also want to do so by being very, very clear that I am not saying that the goal that our Lord had in telling this parable was to make an economic point. I don't think Jesus was any more a proto-capitalist than he was a proto-socialist. Jesus was not a Misesian, despite the desire of some in this room. He certainly wasn't a Keynesian. I believe him to have been the Son of the living God who came to bring humanity redemption. But there's a still less sublime lesson to be learned from the parables. There are aspects of the parables that teach us something about life. They often contain insights into gritty aspects of human reality that can help us negotiate our way through this world more prudently and more soberly. In the same way that these 2 sons display an insufficiency in their response to the father's demand, I think that their responses represent also 2 dominant economic systems that are essentially, in one way or another, insufficient. These two economic systems have always represented the way people seek to resolve problems having to do with economics, having to do with needs and desires. And these two economic systems are both insufficient, but in different ways. I speak of the two dominant economic systems that have been employed in organizing our lives across the centuries, because I don't think that the effort to provide human betterment is first and foremost the result of some kind of systematic intellectual effort. It's not first and foremost ideological. These categorizations and systemizations are indeed important, but intellectual categorizations come later. First and foremost, people act. They strive for their survival, which has been the main concern of the human family until relatively recently for most of our history. And people do this by thinking and by acting. As people become aware of their needs and their desires, they work to harness the resources available to them to meet those goals. This is the very stuff of economics. Now, in the course of thinking about this question, many people choose from two basic options. One approach is to use their intelligence, what they know personally of their circumstance, to persuade others to exchange something of value with them, to cooperate together for mutual benefit. But there's another approach, one that in many ways is probably the most common experience known through history, and that is, after assessing needs and desires, people sometimes decided that it's just easier to take from others, if they're strong enough, whatever it is that they need or want. That's the essential nature of the collectivist approach to economic life. It might be through tribal warfare, it might be through fiat of a commissar like in the Soviet Union, but taking, backed up by force, is central to that type of an economic arrangement. Now, this trajectory that I've just outlined for you should contain a great deal more information to unpack it, but we've had 4 days of that, and I don't have 4 more days to unpack it all for you. It does contain more nuance and detail, but that's why we have Acton University. But these two ways by which people have sought to get what they need are, I think, the two dominant ways that describe the economic systems. Now, if we return to the sons in the parable, you remember that I said that both responses were deficient in some way. For the son who initially refuses the father's command, the deficiency is obvious right from the get-go. As a patriarch, that father had the right, had a justifiable claim to the obedience of his son. His son was going to be the heir to his property. And perhaps it was exactly that just claim that prompted the son's change of heart. But again, frustrating points of the parables very often, we don't know. It doesn't say. We have to derive some meaning from the parable, not based on what the parable explicitly says. That's why it's a parable. We only know that he eventually went to the field and did what he was asked to do. He accomplished what he should have done from the first request. We come to see the second son as guiltier than the first, for he certainly did not fulfill the command of the Father. This is the conclusion of the listeners to Jesus, who were asked, who did the will of the Father? And they say the first one who did what he said, what was asked of him. You see, one son gave the right answer, but never followed through. Now, again, speculating, maybe he did intend to go out to the field and work, and perhaps something happened to him. Maybe he grew ill. Maybe some other great priority, something of great importance came up. The bottom line is that he never accomplished what he was asked to do and what he said he would do. So it should be clear by now that what I'm doing here is employing this metaphor as an example of these two sons remedying economic deprivation. Free exchange, command economy, and a control system. Even those categories, free exchange and command and control, they lend themselves to intellectual interpretation, which is exactly what I'm avoiding at this point. It's not that I don't think we should develop a systematic way of looking at human experience or that we should think deeply about it. This is really what developing a set of ideas or a philosophy is about. It's just that it is important to understand the roots of our ideas and philosophy so that we understand rather than obfuscate what we really think is true and right and just. In good measure, I think this is part of the problem we have in understanding economic systems today and choosing between the alternatives. Somehow, people have gotten caught in an ideological battle of choosing one or the other rather than thinking through what's the right thing. Today, many people largely see the choice as being left or right. That's the way it's described. Left or right, progressive or conservative, socialist or capitalist, globalist or nationalist. Now, these are certainly legitimate ways of looking at things, but I also think they are inadequate insofar as that they fail to keep in focus the goal of any good society, which is people's well-being. Parts of the current political divide in our world, especially in Western countries, has been a question of the end or the telos, not keeping that in mind. What is it we're aiming for? People very often fail to see its full import and meaning. Now, what if instead we looked at the question of our economic and political choices along a continuum, not an ideological continuum, but a continuum of what human beings need or what can hinder them from obtaining what they need. Now, if we look at questions primarily from the standpoint of human nature or the nature of the human person, rather than categories of modern economics or modern politics, rather, how would it look then? From the perspective of this paradigm, where at one end of the pole there is complete freedom from government restraint and from all external coercive force, and at the other end is complete constraint by the state. What if we looked at it that way? Some might name these opposite poles anarchy and slavery or something along these lines. But I do think that the various concerns at the heart of contemporary debates can find a placement somewhere along this continuum. Whatever your concerns are, you look on that continuum and you can place them. Consider, for example, the contemporary left-right continuum and how this compares to the freedom and slavery paradigm. So that crony capitalism and politically favored industries would, for example, be seen on the right end, of the left-right axis, whereas policies like national health insurance or cradle-to-grave welfare programs would be seen on the left. But if you looked at it through my paradigm, you see that both groupings would appear more on the statist end. Indeed, given the degree to which the corporate world in America and in Europe has embraced the whole language of the political agenda of wokenness, I'm an old man, I'm just learning new words. The similarity of outlook between crony capitalists and the political left becomes even more apparent. They become allies, not enemies. If, however, we begin to look at things from the lens of the human person, our needs, our need for freedom, our need to be saved from want, if we see the economy as the result of human action and decisions from the bottom up rather than the top down, if we understand that liberty, while not the total reason for our existence or the goal of our existence, even though it is a worthy goal for any society to ensure freedom, but not the total goal, then we come to a different, and I suggest, more hopeful view of things. So it's at this point that the importance of intellectual endeavor and clarification becomes so important. Lord Acton, perhaps more than any other historian, taught this when he once wrote that the lover of liberty is the one who begins with ideas. To begin with an idea that we should act from conscience in the light of truth about man is to bring into being a philosophy that seeks to instantiate a policy rather than a policy in search of a philosophy. That way of doing it, the policy in search of a philosophy, is a post facto rationalization. It would result in the triumph of justice over expediency. The collectivist ideology, whether of the right or of the left, manifests its own inner contradictions, not abstractly, but quite concretely and quite starkly. We see it in Venezuela today and in North Korea. We see it manifested in its more cautious versions as well, when societies succumb incrementally to totalitarian penchants, heating the water slowly, as it were, to boil the frog. The problem, I'd suggest, is that the coordination of human action is an objective need for success and for survival. The problem arises when most political leaders seem to think that they are the ones who need to do the coordinating. The metaphor of the invisible hand employed by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments is admittedly overused and poorly employed very often. But to my mind, the metaphor helps us to understand how people can freely cooperate with one another without directly intending to cooperate with one another. That's the remarkable thing about it. To bring about an increase in society's overall economic well-being with a minimal use of force. I personally prefer the phrase spontaneous order, which you've probably heard during the week, to describe this necessity, which one writer defines as the result of human action, but not the execution of human design. Think about that. The result of human action without somebody having designed it. Now this brings us back to our parable as a metaphor for economic systems. I take the will of the Father in this parable to represent the good of humanity, what we might call the common good, which is, of course, the sum total of conditions of social living whereby persons are enabled more fully and readily to achieve their own perfection. That's what the common good is. The response of the respective brothers I take as the two dominant ways in which humankind has attempted to achieve the common good and the deficiencies in both. The one brother claims to have great interest in achieving the common good, but he never does it. Maybe even does worse. The other initially shows no interest in the task at hand and even appears to turn away from it. But in the end, he actually accomplishes it. Now, I don't want to overstate this point. As I say, interpreting the parables is a hazardous exercise. But I do think that some socialists have had the right intention to remedy human want. But as the parable shows, and as we know from our own experience and see throughout all of history, it's not enough to have good intentions. Not if we're serious about achieving our goals. The idea of a spontaneous order has much to offer in terms of how it permits people, even those who don't know each other or even like one another, can cooperate peacefully. It permits and ensures that the relative costs of things, their scarcity or their abundance, comes automatically baked in to the price of a product, if that price is freely established. And it allows that what people in their own locales determine that they need can be communicated to the producers producing what they need. This astounding feat of coordination, think about it, is accomplished not through political bickering and lobbying or crony capitalism or via regulatory agencies, but through free pricing. I know it doesn't sound sexy. It doesn't sound poetic, but it works. The liberty of people being left free to buy and to sell something at a price they choose at which to buy it or sell it is enough to accomplish this masterful achievement of coordination. The achievement of this wonder of coordination has accomplished great, great material good throughout the world, dramatically reducing poverty rates and raising the standard of living for literally billions of people over the last 2 centuries. Still, we must press the question, is it deficient? The deficiency of the Son is the deficiency of the spontaneous order, despite what it has accomplished, because freedom is not enough. And that means that the spontaneous order is not enough. It would certainly be enough if the only thing at stake were the material fulfillment of human wants and desires. The problem is that human beings aren't just material beings. We're just not a bunch of desires for material things. We are far more than our physicality. We are designed and we yearn for eternity. And if we do not understand that part of who we are, then what we do is end up looking for substitutes to fill that quest for eternity. Then we don't just miss a little something. We miss the entire end goal. We miss the telos, the reason of our existence. Markets are never simply markets by themselves. Markets are always social because they always consist of social interactions. We must underscore the need to form the culture that surrounds markets, that shapes the choices that people make within markets. This is the real insufficiency of markets. It is the same insufficiency in freedom and in all of human life when the telos of human existence is not understood or grasped. Some years ago, I wrote a book entitled Defending the Free Market. And in that book, I recounted my personal journey back to my faith by way of the circuitous route of economics, of all things. As my own confusions about economics began to clarify, I began to find myself looking at the bigger picture, at the whole picture. And here I want to address in particular those millennials who are listening in to this conversation, those of you who may find socialism attractive and all of its variants as well. A sentiment that is shared not just by socialists, but by some market-critical conservatives as well, who fail to see that many of the forms of nationalism too easily devolve into just another form of socialism. I want you to know that I understand and I share your ardent desire for a more just and humane world, for better conditions for the marginalized, for the poor, for the vulnerable. I share your desire for a society that protects our deepest moral traditions and our respective national and cultural heritages. I share your goals and your intentions. But I think these intentions need to be informed by sound economics and the lessons of history. In light of these contemporary currents, I've often thought back to what it was that caused my own intellectual and philosophical tectonic plates to shift. My belief in the need for a more just society originally led me to embrace left activism during a revolutionary period in American history. I speak, of course, of the 1970s. There was a tumult in my own personal life at the time and in the world that surrounded me, and it left me searching for meaning and purpose. I fell in with a bunch of friends who helped me to fill that void. In 1970s California, if there was a sit-in, I was sitting in. And if there was a demonstration, I was holding high the banner. I led the chants, whatever it happened to be. My days were full of picket lines and protests, and my evenings with late conversations alongside my idealistic band of comrades in the struggle. I've recounted this story, I think, even at Acton University, but it's also in the book, of one night I was in my apartment with a bunch of these friends. We were sitting around my living room, and we were each expressing our vision for the future. When the revolution comes, this is what we desire. This is what we want to see happen. Then everyone would be equal. I chimed in, yes, and when the revolution comes, we'll all shop at Gucci. Well, it wasn't laughter that greeted that statement, it was silence. Those my serious socialist friends were silent, and that silence joined the smoke that hung in the air. Sitting next to me was my delightful friend Anne, whom I fondly called my Lesbitarian Trotskyite. Now, she was an orthodox Marxist. She was the one who broke the silence. And she just looked over at me and she said, "Gucci?" All eyes were fixed on me for this great debate. I said, "Well, yes. It's a metaphor for the kind of society that we're trying to build, right? A world where everyone will have equal access to quality goods and services." And her response was, "Gucci?" She scoffed at me and she said, "That's pretty bourgeois. I don't think you're really a socialist." Now, my friends, it's always very uncomfortable when someone knows something about you that you have not yet discovered about yourself. I'd been caught up in a vision for a more just society, and the people who shared that passion with me called it socialism, and I readily embraced it without really concerning myself with the details. I had a neighbor about that time who had a friend to whom he introduced me. And here I met this intelligent, informed, and to my astonishment, conservative person willing to debate with me. He told me at the time he found me delightfully ignorant. And he said he took it upon himself as a personal mission to educate me. Now, always game for sparring, you can't take the Brooklyn out of the boy. I told him to bring it on. And so we ended up debating constantly. I mean constantly, for about 6 months. We exchanged books, we exchanged articles, we exchanged arguments. He gradually supplied me with a little library of liberty. And through reading and debate and conversation, I slowly at first and then very rapidly began to shift my understanding. But it wasn't just my understanding about economics. That's what started it in motion. It wasn't just about politics. That started it in motion. It was the occasion. It was the antipasto, so to speak. But it shifted then to questions about fundamental realities of human nature, of human existence. And as a result, my socialism began to fade. One of those early conversations was about wealth. Now, I made no bones at the time of the necessity for wealth to be redistributed. It seemed obvious to me that as long as the rich lived in luxury, many others would go hungry. To my mind, the logic was unassailable. I thought it should deeply offend anyone's sense of justice. So I shared with my friend my vision for a future world where all of the world's wealth would be redistributed, where people would have equal access to high-quality goods and services. Yes, even Gucci. Not that I particularly care for Gucci today, but it was a metaphor. He said, "I hope you know that in comparison to all past human experience, that most people today, in fact, have access to quality goods and services, more than ever before." While I paused at that observation, never having given it prior consideration, my focus was on the poverty that remained. So I went on. But there's still so much misery in the world, while some have so much. What is needed is a massive redistribution of wealth to correct the systemic problem. Play a mind game with me for a moment, my friend said. Let's imagine that you got your wish and all the wealth in all the world was evenly redistributed. Are you satisfied now? Yes, I said, of course. Wouldn't you be? Wouldn't most people be better off? Even those who had some of their wealth taken away from them would still be able to live at a basic level? It seemed clear to me. Until he asked, is this sustainable? What would happen the next day? And the day after that? What would people do? Where would they work? What do you imagine would happen to the businesses providing all those goods and services that you want everyone to have equal access to? What would happen to all those businesses? At first, I have to admit that I didn't follow the trajectory of where he was taking me. Then he made it simpler for me by pointing out that the majority of the wealth of the richest people in the world was not primarily in their mansions or in their yachts or in their handbags or in their jewelry or in their furs, but first and foremost in their businesses. The very businesses that provide the high-quality goods and services I so desired to be more widely available to people. The majority of wealth is held in stocks and bonds and bank accounts, which are drawn upon in the form of loans and payrolls and capital goods, all this boring stuff that I didn't think about, but that would be the only way to ensure the rising of the standard of living for people. All that wealth is really social. Held in private hands, but social, having a social impact. All of this, I'm so embarrassed to admit to you tonight, was a revelation to me then. This economic way of thinking set in motion a systematic reconsideration of my entire worldview. And this, I suspect, is why the conversation outside the confines of events like Acton University we find to be so frequently frustrating. We enter the debate thinking that if we can just show one or two factual errors or logical fallacies in our opponent's position, that they will be converted. But somebody once said, to silence a man is not to convert him. The effort requires an entire reconceptualization of everything. For me, it involved the reconsideration of what I meant by human rights, property rights, supply and demand, the division of labor and competition, things like that. Until then, these had mostly been phrases to me that you put on a placard, that you shouted in a chant. But through an open-minded reading of various market economists, Hayek, Mises, Bastiat, Friedman, and others, most of whom have been on sale this week at our bookstore. I would have even read Sam Gregg if he was alive at the time, sending out his books from his crib in Tasmania. And as a result of all of this, I came to see that the very source and summit, if you will, should pardon the borrowing of the expression, the very source and summit of economics is the human person. His choices, his actions. Thinking this way about the human person, it ended up being a catalyst for still deeper thinking. And I recalled in my childhood, sitting in that schoolroom at St. Rose of Lima Parish in Brooklyn, New York, where Sister asked us to memorize the answers to the questions in the Baltimore Catechism. And she would lead us in the questions, and we would tell her the answers. This is a memory. I'm turning 68, so this is a 60-year-old memory. It's about 7 years old. Children, who made the world? God made the world, sister. We would respond in unison. Who is God? God is the infinite being, supreme, perfect, who made all things and keeps them in existence. And so it went on. Building up an infrastructure, a way to think about the world, about my place in the world, about my obligations within the world. It taught me that what was important was more than just intentions. It was rather a ready obedience to the truth. Much of that infrastructure that she taught, that most of Western civilization just accepted and took for granted, has been eroded and even dismantled today. Most especially during those fun times of the 1970s in those smoky rooms. And even prior to that. The variants of socialism that we face today are in many ways the result of that period. This is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity to reconstruct that infrastructure. We should be careful not to dismiss today's new socialists as simply enemies of liberty. Some may indeed be of bad will, but others are simply people who, like the younger Bob Sirico, was searching for justice, searching for purpose, and just very confused about it all. To my mind, this represents an opportunity in which we can propose ideas about coherent economics while sharing the anthropological underpinnings of a free and a virtuous society. If we hope to defeat the contemporary attraction of socialism, we must point to a more compelling understanding of why we are in the world in the first place, why our freedom and our property are interrelated, and that they matter in ways that are more than merely utilitarian. I'm not suggesting to you that this path is easy. In fact, for some of you in the room, it will be far more arduous than I can imagine. It is not easy. Intellectual persuasion about topics like economics is hard enough. But conversion to a way of thinking about the human person, one manifested in decisive form in the Scriptures, is an exercise of even greater proportions. Yes, that is hard in our contemporary environments, where people want immediate answers. Short-termism is prevalent everywhere. People want results yesterday, and they don't stay around long enough to read an entire paragraph, let alone an entire book. And a world in which the religious voice is increasingly pushed to the margins of the discourse. But this is why the Acton Institute exists. As a way of serving the common good, but also to promote the cause of liberty and justice in our broken but potentially redeemed world. It is my hope that this underlying message that you have received throughout this week at Acton University, when we have been together exploring ideas, that you will be fortified by the truth of those ideas, and that you will be able to take this and magnify it throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. That was numbing.
Was it numbing?
I'm using it in a good way.
How's your knee?
So one of the highest ranked question right now, and I was kind of wondering this as well. So you talked about economics bringing you actually back to the faith, and you mentioned this man that was sending you books at the time. So what book played the most crucial role in your economic conversion and then eventual conversion back to the faith?
I don't think there was one book. I'm trying to think what the first. There were a lot of articles too. I suppose the first one was Bastiat's The Law, because it's a pithy little short book, easy, especially if you have teenagers, intelligent teenagers who can read beyond a tweet. This would be, I guess they're not on Twitter anymore, right? Maybe you have to come up with pictures now, but this was, what I liked about Bastiat was it displayed how to think about things, not so much what to think. And then, I began reading, I read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and then The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, yes. And then parts of Socialism and Human Action later on, by Mises, and those are heavy books.
Yeah. So the top-ranked question right now, and this is an interesting question, is you recently debated Rusty Reno, and so somebody in the audience wants to know what's happening at First Things, and where do you and Rusty Reno most disagree?
I had two debates with Rusty Reno, and I suppose they're still on YouTube. One was under the aegis of the King's College in New York, and the other was at Villanova University. And these were night-to-night debates. And I just have to say this, and I don't say this with any personal rancor to Mr. Reno, Dr. Reno, but okay, you have a bad night one night, and you hear these arguments. The next night you come back ready for it, right? He wasn't ready for it the second night. And I just don't think he thinks deeply about these questions. And it's very difficult for me to understand what he thinks the role of limited government. I suppose he would describe himself as a believer in limited government. Maybe he just wants to limit it in different areas, but he sure wants to expand it in a lot of areas. And I'm not going to rehearse the whole debate. I don't think we disagree theologically, on questions of morality and stuff like that. It's an economic debate. And I also tend to think that he makes the mistake of seeing in economics the essential answer to the question. And I don't see it, as I think I've made very clear here tonight. I don't see economics as the essential answer. And in that regard, he's very much like the Marxists, because they see the problem as an economic problem. And maybe that's why he puts economics at such a high level. So I would say something in that neighborhood.
Yes. So there's another question.
I should also say this, too. It is very frustrating for me to see a magazine of First Things stature built by a man I knew very well, and by men that I knew very well, being taken over. The platform that was provided for people who believe in these kinds of ideas that I've described, being taken over by people who don't believe in these kinds of ideas and who couldn't build a platform of that sort, and just going to town and burying these people. That bugs me personally, on a personal level.
Yes, yeah. So this next question, so we have over 90 countries represented. We talked about this being the most geographically diverse Acton University that we've hosted. So in your opinion, what one message do you think everyone here should take back to their communities, nations, families?
That freedom and virtue work, that they need each other. Freedom is an empty vacuum. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's a set of options. But if you had a set of options of a whole bunch of Bitcoin and never opted for them, you would be poor when Bitcoin goes up, as I'm told it's beginning to go up again. So, if you have options, you don't have anything. Freedom isn't anything. It's a vacuum. You have to fill it with virtue. And virtue needs legs. It needs habits. It needs institutions and cultural acceptance. And especially if it's the virtue of tending toward the needs of those who are vulnerable, it needs markets. And it needs internationalized markets.
Now, I knew this question was going to come up regarding integralism. So is liberalism compatible with the Catholic view of the human person? Is some form of integralism the only genuine manifestation of Catholic social thought?
Well, let's define our terms here, because we're talking to a wide audience, and some people, what's integralism? Integralism isn't just things being integral, connected, synthesized to one another, but it's a particular form of political philosophy that essentially is a form of theocracy. It's a form of the amalgamation of the church and state, that the government not only exists by the permission of God, but is interpreted and interprets certain passages in Scripture to believe. And in this case, it's a Catholic manifestation. The Protestant manifestation, and maybe I'm not too careful in making this analogy, but I would say it's probably theonomy that would be the Protestant version of Catholic integralism. It's just getting things done for God by the state. That's a simple way to put it. And I believe that a proper understanding of the liberal idea, as articulated by for instance, Lord Acton, can be compatible with Catholic social teaching. I don't mean by liberalism in theology, liberalism in morality. I mean by liberalism the idea that freedom is the political end of man, not that it is the total end of man. Now, there are forms of liberalism that are anti-clerical, that are anti-religious, and those are not the kinds of liberalism that I'm talking about. I'm talking about an idea that cherishes liberty and contextualizes it and attempts to situate it in a juridical framework and in a moral framework. And I believe that is certainly compatible. And if anything, this idea of separation of powers, that's one of the kind of pillars of the liberal thought, was set in motion by the distinction Jesus makes between God and Caesar. And so I think that there is no, I don't think we're called to a theocracy. I think it's very dangerous for both the church and for society in general. And where the church has ruled society, it has diminished, it has become weak. You look at the Eastern European church-state situation. Germany is a very good example of it. Sweden, these countries that have official church states. I think the founding fathers of the United States were very wise to separate as institutions church and state. What the founding fathers did not do was separate religion from society. And I think that's where the confusion is in a lot of the contemporary debate.
Yeah. So the next question is in the same vein. And so many critics of the market, following Marx, and you mentioned this earlier, feel that they erode the culture. So are markets really neutral?
Markets are empty. They have to be filled with something. And markets can. This is why I alluded to the woke wokeness of businesses. I mean, you have a lot of businesses that are promoting, especially this month, promoting things that go contrary to the norms and the traditions of Western civilization. I think blaming the market as a process of discovery, which is what the market is, for the way in which the market is used, is like blaming a brain surgeon for Jack the Ripper. You know, they both use scalpels, right? But they use them in very different ways. And I think the solution, because then the next question is, well, how do we combat this, is to be better at it, to shift the cultural self-assumptions to the point where businesses respond to the moral good rather than the kind of decadent. So yes, certainly markets have effects on culture. And because of that, we need to utilize the market for it to have a good effect on culture.
So you talked some at the end of your talk about civil discourse and how bad it is today. So how do we show solidarity with socialists in their aspirations while being critical of their solutions?
Well, the first thing you have to do is make sure you know what their aspirations are, because some of them, you know, I mean, more and more they've imbibed in the culture of death. So you have to make sure, if by aspirations we mean they want the well-being of the poor, I think one of the things we have to do is talk to them. You know, there's this thing, especially this has to do maybe with conservative Christians. I see this all the time. I see this among people. If you disagree with a person, you have to be mean to them. You know, you have to make sure that they know you don't like them. And that's a great way to persuade somebody to your viewpoint. I was preaching in my parish, and I said to parents, because parents have problems with their kids, you know, are they going to accept the faith and all that? I said, it doesn't seem to me to be an effective tool to nag your kid and to, you know, be mean to your kids. Especially if they're a little older, where they're independent, and they represent some idea or they're engaged in some lifestyle that you don't approve of, I think you have the obligation to express that disapproval and to withdraw support in appropriate ways. But you don't have to be nasty about it. And I think that's the same thing with people we disagree with. One of the most effective, to my mind, one of the most effective persuaders on the libertarian conservative part of the spectrum in the better part of the 20th century was William F. Buckley. And if you watch him on his firing line, and those of you who have never seen firing line, you know, a lot of them are on YouTube. You can go on YouTube and watch them. He was winsome. He was funny. He would cut with a scalpel so sharp that his opponent didn't realize they had been sliced until they saw the blood on the floor. And I think that's the way to do it. I mean, and when I say his opponent, it really was the ideas that he would disembody, because he was more interested in the idea than not just belligerent nastiness, which is what we see even among conservative commentators today. You know, I think it is lamentable that we've gone from that kind of conservative engagement to the intellectual food fights that you see on Fox News. You know, where you get, and I've experienced it. I'm on conservative talk shows and get yelled at by hosts and their comrades. I'm talking about conservatives who, when you express an idea that they don't agree with, they don't talk it through. Buckley never would have done that. He would have disemboweled me. You know, he would have argued about it, talked about it. But now it's just belligerent. And I think we have to respect people. I mean, if all of our philosophy is to build a society that's good, that's beneficial for people, that's virtuous and everything. And then we turn around and say nasty things to people or about people or troll people. This is not acceptable, to my mind. I mean, being witty is great. You know, and sometimes we slip and then we have to apologize, you know, when we go a little too far. You have a little too much Brooklyn blood in you, and I understand it, and you have to pull back. But the point is, we have to fundamentally believe in human dignity. That's the basis of everything we're saying. And that includes our opponents, people who don't agree with us. And it's much more fun to do that, I think. We never set up a litmus test of who can come to Acton University based on their ideas. For all I don't, there may be Marxists here. I don't know. Should I ask? All we do ask is that you're respectful and you make an argument for your position.
So we're really just about out of time now, but as we close, I want to know if you have any final concluding thoughts or reflections from this Acton University.
Well, this has been just such a wonderful, some of you I've talked to, I said it feels like you're drinking from a fire hydrant, right? You'll have a chance to digest all of this over time. Hopefully you've taken good notes, and if not, we have what are these little things
Flash
called?
drives.
Flash drives, that you can hear them all again. I'm not faking this stuff, you know. I'm 68 years old. I just really want to urge you, make use of this. You have had put at your disposal, what a feast has been placed at your disposal. And it's not just one time. Again, those flash drives, the books, the contacts, the Alumni Association, all of the different infrastructure that the new technologies enable us to produce. Use this. What a shame if you just go from this and just go to the next tweet. You know, ponder this stuff, integrate this stuff, use this stuff. We had a subgroup of Acton University, and it was business people. And at the end of it, I wanted to kind of bring it to a conclusion and, you know, get people to think about it. And I showed the last scene from Schindler's List. I don't know if you've seen Schindler's List, but you really should see it. Brilliant. It was the story of Mr. Schindler, who was not such a stellar person, but who at the time that was needed did the right thing. He created this fake factory. He was a member of the Nazi Party. This fake factory that was producing armaments in the midst of Nazi Germany. And the list were people he could employ to come and work in this fake factory. So they would build these armaments, pass them around the thing, and then melt them down, and then do it again. But the reason he was doing all of this was he was able to put people on the list, and anyone he got on the list was saved from the gas chambers or whatever. And the trick was he had to buy these people onto the list. So he literally gave his wedding band. He sold things that he had. People actually pulled gold out of their teeth in order to buy another person. And at the end of the whole thing, Schindler is leaving, and everyone, the Allies have come, and the guards have run, and everybody's free. But they're all still in this factory, and they want to get him out because they know he was a member of the Nazi Party. If he were caught, he would be immediately arrested and everything. And they wanted him to get into safety, and they left a letter saying what he had done for them. But as he walks into the courtyard, he sees all of these people who have worked in the factory. And he sees this car that's going to take him away. And he says to the kind of foreman, he says, "I didn't do enough. I could have done more. I could have sold more. He said, that car, we could have bought 20 more people with that car. He said, this pin, this Nazi pin, it's gold. I could have gotten 2 more people, 1 at least. And he breaks down. I could have done more. My friends, do more. Don't wait until that moment to say, I could have done more. What has been placed at your disposal through the generosity of incredibly generous people is for you to use in your societies. So that's what I'd want to say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.